Today in the bunker, we're going to make a post office suitable for the wasteland. If you've been following the channel for a while, you may be familiar with the Big Boxo kits. This is a kit from that box, and like all of the rest, it is covered in some sort of scunge left over from decades of being stored wherever it was, an attic, under some stairs, in a basement, who knows. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and wash this with a little bit of warm water and some washing up liquid and see what we get. I'm going to remove this part first. These kits came with these paper inserts to make it look like things were going on inside there. They're very quaint and 1950s, but we don't need that in there for our build, so we're going to set that aside as a memento to history. Alright, well that cleaned up pretty well. These generally come out looking almost new once you wash them off. There's a little bit of wear, that's fine. Of note are the lights from the outside of the building are intact. Normally these are broken or missing, so we're going to very carefully paint those and add them back onto the model. So those should look really good. I scratch built some for the police station and they came out pretty good, I thought, but I like these original ones as well, so we'll paint those up very carefully later. One of the other things I'm doing is removing the glass doors so that we can prime this and not spray these over or have to tape them or anything else. They don't always come off. Sometimes they're glued in place, but if you're lucky, they'll just pop right out. These assemble in the standard Plasticville manner. They've got these tabs. They only go together one way, so if you start putting a building together and you have trouble getting it to fit, check and see if it's not like the wall in the wrong place. I've only done that several times in these videos. So once you get it, make sure that they all fit, and sometimes you have to file the little tabs to make them fit not quite so snug or maybe just fit the way you want. Then I go ahead and I glue them with some Plastruct cement, but you can use any kind of plastic glue or super glue and put them together. The biggest thing is just trying to make sure that they're square. Sometimes that's a challenge because these walls can be bent. Like I think this back wall is bent slightly, but that's fine. So I'm going to glue this together, and then we're going to take some chipboard and just make a base for this, and we'll hot glue it on there. I like to use Plastruct cement because it will literally weld the plastic together, and it will, anytime you've got a little seam where you've got pieces joined together, it will wick itself down in there. So it makes it pretty easy to put things together. To cover up the Plasticville portion of the signage, and this kit is a lot less of a problem than a lot of them because it actually says U.S. Post Office. It doesn't say Plasticville in huge letters. It's just right there. So I'm going to take some of this Plastruct strip plastic and we'll make ourselves a sign base that will go around this Plasticville, and then we'll cover that up with something else. All right, so there's our little sign holder. If you don't have any of this plastic stuff, that's fine. You could use some chipboard or some balsa wood or whatever you have just to build up a little sign base, and then we can glue something else on top of that. To make a base, I just took a piece of chipboard and just traced around there. So we'll cut that out with our trusty Olfa knife, and we'll get ready and hot glue this together. Usually the easiest way to glue these down, I use a hot glue gun. You could use PVA. I've got some of my older buildings I did with PVA. It just takes a while. But I try to put some glue underneath any of these projections that come out and then let that firm up. And then I will go back and glue along the inside. Put a little bead in there, and some of these buildings are easier to get inside than others. But it doesn't take much. And once that's firmed up, that becomes pretty solid, pretty gamer-proof. One of the optional things that I'll do, Plasticville buildings always have this little cutout for a wire. You can put a light in there. That's why a lot of the kits you'll find have a melted spot because somebody put too bright of a light in there or too close to the plastic. But I usually glue something over that from the inside or the outside. In this case, I just used some scrap chipboard, little dab of hot glue, got it in there. So this is a pretty solid piece now. So I'm going to take this outside and we're going to rattle can prime this and get it ready to go. I neglected to mention earlier, when you glue these buildings together and get them on a base, the real test is whether or not the roof goes on satisfactorily. Sometimes you may have to file some pieces off or sand them or add something somewhere, but in this case, goes right on, no problem. I went ahead and primed this black, and then Zenithal primed it gray from the top, that being Zenithal. That helps seal this chipboard. I used to put sanding sealer on these, but I think it's kind of overkill. Just a good amount of paint on them is enough to seal them. And we're going to let that dry a little bit more, and we'll start putting some color on it. In the meantime, I started working on this. It is a air handler unit. It's a 3D print, and I'll try to find the file and link it in the description. If you have a 3D printer, this is a wonderful thing to print and put on top of buildings. You can configure this. It's individual pieces, so you can make them as extensive as you want. If not, then try to just scratch build something like that. A little bit of chipboard. You could make yourself an air handler pretty easy and stick it on there. Maybe we'll do a video on that. To dress up these glass doors a little bit, I'm going to make them look like reinforced glass. We're going to cut out a piece of this plastic window mesh, and then we'll glue it on there with some PVA. I've just put some PVA. I'm using Eileen's Tacky Glue. You can use whatever PVA you have. We're going to smear this on here, and this will dry clear, and it'll give it kind of a dirty look too at the same time. So it's sort of a bonus for what we're doing. But you just want a nice thin coat on there. And then we'll take this and line it up. Do it off camera so you can't see it. That's always the best. And we'll line this up so that the pattern is the way we want it. And we'll put that on there like that. Press that in. Okay, and we will, it's going to take a little bit for that to dry, but that's fine. We got other things to do on this in the meantime. And once this is dry, we're just going to trim right up next to it with a razor knife, and then we'll just snap it back into place right in the front door. So we'll get back to that later. To put a finish on the front, we're going to kind of make sort of a faux stone sort of thing. So I'm going to leave this light gray color, and we will add, using some sponge, because that's our favorite thing to use, we're going to add some dark gray, and I just mixed just some black and some gray craft paint just to taste. And we'll just add that all over. Alright, so we'll give that a good sponging and just add that all over. And we're just going to do the front. The sides will be sort of a stucco kind of color. We'll let that dry a little bit, and then we'll put on some tan. And we'll just randomly sponge that on as well. And it'll dry a little darker than it goes on. It looks kind of bright, but it'll darken up as it goes. Next we'll add just a little bit of white. Do that very sparingly. And then we'll do the same with just a very small amount of black. And again, like the white, kind of less is more. And that gives us sort of almost a faux sort of granite appearance. I'm going to take that dark gray that we used and water that down quite a bit. And then we're just going to take a brush and just lay it in all of these mortar lines between these stones, just to help accentuate the division. One of the other things I'm going to do is take just some very thin black wash and just outline all of the architectural details on here. You could skip the step of putting the dark gray and the mortar lines and just put the wash in there. That would work fine too. So I did around all of the signage, all of the letters. I was going to do around inside the windows, but I'm going to wait. We're going to paint the window frames kind of a dull metallic color, maybe with some rust, and then we'll put that black wash around the edges of that. I'm just going to use my usual craft paint gunmetal color and very carefully kind of fill in these window frames. And neatness counts here. You don't want to get this metal color up on the stone. It's kind of a pain to get off of there. We maybe should have done this first, but we'll live. I cut in those windows with that gunmetal and then put that wash around them to kind of help accentuate that they're inset a little bit. I also ended up putting that wash in all of the mortar lines. I just liked the way it looked, a little darker, a little more defined. Did all around the sign. So as soon as that dries, we'll put some color on that sign, and then we'll start working on the back and the sides. While we wait for that wash to dry, I'm going to take just some nutmeg brown and or just whatever color you're using kind of for your all-purpose rust, and just sort of stippling that on there a little bit to give that kind of a worn appearance. And just do that to taste. You don't have to do it at all. If this building is still fairly well maintained, then maybe that's not even a thing. And here's our door from earlier with the sort of safety glass effect on there. I kind of like how that came out. So I'm going to put some gunmetal on these door handles and maybe a little bit of rust as well. It doesn't take much, kind of dress those up a little bit. So we'll put that aside to dry for later. For the signage, I'm just going to use a little bit of barn red, but any sort of dark red or whatever color you want to use is fine. And let a little bit of that gray show through if you can, just to give it kind of a worn look. Unless, of course, like I said, the building is well maintained and then, you know, painted as fresh as you like. All right, so that gives that a nice worn appearance, but a little bit of color so it'll pop just slightly. To do the stucco bits, I'm just going to kind of overbrush with this tan color. And any kind of tan you have is fine. Or you could use another gray. Just depends on what sort of shade you want this stucco to be. We're going to lighten it up with a dry brush of white in a bit. We may put a wash on it just to help accentuate it. So just kind of do it to taste. It may take a couple of coats to get that to a color that you want. But if it ends up being a little mottled and dirty, that's fine. That's kind of actually what we're going for. So I'm going to cut in all of these windows and doors, and then we'll start putting some wash and maybe a little bit of dry brush, some highlights on there. I cut in around all of these windows and doors. I just used that pewter gray color. We'll put a black wash on that later. I'm going to cut in the windows themselves as a gunmetal. All right, so just very carefully cut in with that gunmetal. We'll go back and add some of that brown as a rusting effect. Put a wash on there. That'll help that pop. And then we're going to dry brush, probably with a white, over most of this and catch this kind of industrial gray window frame, door frame, all that stuff. I figure probably most of the money was spent on the fancy stone front. The rest of this is going to be a typical utilitarian sort of, you know, not glamorous government building. While we wait for the windows to dry so we can put some wash and whatnot on them, I'm just going to take some more of this pewter gray and we're going to dry brush the roof sections. These bits here I think are supposed to be like probably flashing, so we'll paint those either gray or dull gunmetal, I don't know. Anyway, but we're going to dry brush the gravelly portion first just to kind of get a little bit of that detail. And if you know how to dry brush, don't do it the way I'm doing it. Actually dry brush it. but that'll still work. So just do that to taste. Just to make it pop a little bit more, I'm going back and trying to actually lightly dry brush this with white, just to kind of enhance that sort of texture that's on there. After a bit of dry brushing, we painted that metallic, and then I just sponged on some of that nutmeg color just to give it a little bit of a rusty texture. So it didn't come out too bad. So we're going to add our air handler unit, and I started painting part of this. I just went ahead and primed this with a rust-colored primer, and then dry brushed it with the gunmetal that we used earlier. And then I've just kind of sponged on a little bit of that nutmeg. I can't even think of the name. I said it 2 seconds ago. To give that kind of a rusty texture. You could also paint that in varying grays. A lot of these, well, pretty much all of these are actually galvanized, so that would probably look a little more realistic, but maybe not. I think your eye kind of expects to see sort of a metallic color, and it would look fine gray, though. You could do it either way. Any way you do it looks good. So I'm going to finish painting this, and then we will set about gluing that on here. And in the meantime, we'll also go ahead and dry brush the side and back walls and apply a little bit of wash, and then we'll put some paint on these doors. The dry brushing white, it's pretty subtle, but it does really brighten that up and bring out that texture a bit, so it's definitely worth doing. Also going to paint the lights that go on the front of the building. I'm going to use kind of a bronze color on the metal parts, and we'll put some green on there for verdigris, and then I'm going to do kind of an off-white stained for the actual globe itself, the glass portion. Alright, our lights came out pretty good. Once we put some matte varnish on there, that'll help dull down everything and really bring out that verdigris that's on there. And you can see I have a window in place. The holders for the little display bits that we took out earlier, or the display thing we removed, that holder, if you cut the plastic to the correct size, it holds the window very nicely. So we'll put some windows in, or some glass in the other windows, and get this ready for some varnish. And for the glass, I'm just using whatever clear plastic packaging I can find that I have laying around. This came from some super glue, but various kinds of food packaging, blisters for models, all those sorts of things are usually very good and generally have a size suitable for the windows on most model buildings. To hold these windows in place, I'm just putting down a bead of PVA around the inside of the windowsill and just pressing that plastic against it. This Tacky 2 works pretty well for that. It'll hold it in place until it dries. And it dries clear, so if you get a little bit on the glass, no big deal. You won't even notice. Alright, now our air conditioning unit's done. I just super glued that on. You could probably hot glue it as well. Super glue takes a little bit of time to set up, but it provides a pretty good bond, so that should hold fairly well. When I get ready to varnish this, I'm going to use a matte varnish. I'm going to leave the glass as it is so that it'll get a very dirty, dusty covering. If you don't want your glass to be like that, don't glue it until after you've done all of the varnishing. I am, however, going to leave the front door out because with the PVA on the back, it already has that effect, and I'm afraid that if I do too much on the front, you won't even be able to see the safety glass. While the wash and whatnot is drying, I went ahead and printed out a little sign, and I just cut out a backing piece of chipboard, and instead of trying to paint that or anything, the exposed edges, I just take a Sharpie. Well, let me do it off camera so you can't see it. I just take a Sharpie and just run that over those while I juggle it. And that cleans that up nicely. You don't have to paint it. And then I'm just going to take Mod Podge and use that to affix this, which, you know, is an excellent use of Mod Podge. It's one of the things it's actually made for. We'll just take a little bit of Mod Podge, put a nice thin coat on there. Make sure we cover the whole thing. We'll take our sign and very carefully align it. And then and just press that down and let that dry. And then we'll very carefully put a coat of it on the top too, and that will make that pretty bulletproof. It does tend to smear the ink a little bit, so I tend to stipple around where it's actually printed. That'll kind of minimize that. And we're going to age the sign anyway, so really not going to be able to notice, but it is something to keep in mind when you're using it. Now that we have our signage attached and our front door put back into place, everything has been hit with the varnish, so it is ready to go to be on the table. Looks pretty good, I think. You know, it's a basic, very basic kit, but you can kind of tart it up a little bit with some paint. You could also fortify the windows, block them off. I should have made probably more of them broken like that one, but you know, all in all, I'm pretty happy with it. It's a good kit. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I hope it helps inspire you to make something awesome, and I hope you have a fantastic day.